Hello, my name is Lance Belderon, and I will be representing the side against euthanasia today. So euthanasia negatively impacts the moral fabric of society. So I'd like to begin with a quote introducing the tone of this topic from American novelist Pearl S. Buck, in which she says that euthanasia is a long, smooth-sounding word, and it conceals its dangers as long, smooth words do. But the danger is there, nevertheless. The type of danger that we see with euthanasia in this debate is of three parts: an economical, an ethical, and a moral sense. The threat that euthanasia pits against the morale of society involves the value of life itself, where it essentially devalues the lives of the will-being you status of people that comes from making this into a public policy. There are three issues that go along with the general devaluing of life. The first issue being that euthanasia will not only be for people who are terminally ill. The second issue being that euthanasia threatens the moral attitude that is associated with the Hippocratic Oath. And the third issue being that euthanasia will ultimately be an alternative to those who cannot afford the alternative treatments for their illnesses. Right? Yeah. We will continue with our speeches.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted. Yeah, that was the full intro. You guys haven't gotten into your speeches yet, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's just
that was. Yeah. So if you guys want to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, sorry, I just wasn't sure.
Sorry about that.
But we can start with introductions without. I was just going to go over just the basic outline of the debate, just so we all knew the timings and everything.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, yeah.
I'll start with that, and then we can go to your introductions. Does that sound all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So welcome, Texas. It's great connecting with you guys again. And so I just wanted to bring do a brief introduction. In case you guys don't remember, my name is Monsi, and this is Sean, and we're the co-presidents of David Suzuki's international debate team. And so we're going to be debating the pros and cons of euthanasia. So just to begin with the brief outline of it, we're going to begin with the economical pro side, and then moving to con, followed by the social pro and social con, and finally moving on to ethical. Since there will be no expert here today, I'm going to extend the rebuttaling period to approximately 35 minutes. So it's going to end approximately at 4:25. And I will be giving a 5-minute warning just so each side knows they can probably get 1 or 2 more points in before we have to move on to conclusion statements. And then we will have the end of the debate. So you guys have an introduction prepared? Is that what you guys, if you guys would like to present that right now?
No, yeah, we're just really going to introduce ourselves, and we don't really have a built introduction since we're just going to go on with our speeches after.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So we'll start with because we usually start with the pro side for the debate. So is that okay if we start with the economical pro today?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. So we're going to begin. I'm going to pass the mic over to our economical people, and we'll begin with that speech.
Okay, one of the main reasons euthanasia should be legal is because the cost of putting someone under life support is just too unsustainable for a country's economy and for the families inflicted with the burden of keeping their loved ones alive. Many patients actually fail to communicate preferences to their families, meaning they could be subject to costly, invasive treatments they did not actually want in the first place. For the people who do request assisted suicide, 66% of the reasons for a patient's request for being euthanized is because they don't want to be a financial burden on their families. And can you really blame them when the cost of proper health care is around $35,000 to $50,000, while the cost of a drug for assisted suicide is $35, for example, in Oregon? As for a country's economy, in Canada, for example, provincial governments are scrambling to contain health care spending, with a contributing problem being that 25% of all healthcare costs are devoted to caring for patients in their last year of life. Medical assistance in dying would be beneficial as it would reduce annual healthcare spending across Canada by between 34.7 million and 138.8 million, exceeding the direct costs associated with its implementation. The cost would reduce since euthanasia would prevent people from going into a resource-intensive period in their life. This period is near the ending of a person's life in which a disproportionately high amount of healthcare spending goes towards. And with euthanasia, published data from the Netherlands and Belgium, where medically assisted to death is legal, shows that 60% of patients will have their lives shortened by only 1 month. This shows that euthanasia prevents people from going into a resource-intensive period in their life, which would help lift the burdens off of their families and the economy.
And we will
Thank
now like to move on to the con side for economical arguments.
My name is Freddie, and I will present the con side of the economic aspect. In regards to euthanasia, it is not a great option, and furthermore, we cannot put a cost in a human life. In addition, while the savings of money and time may seem enticing, here in the U.S., the savings would equal around to $990 million each year, which only represents a fraction of our healthcare spending, which is 0.07% in the United States. This amount of savings is nearly negligible in the grand scheme of healthcare spending. Another factor to consider is the cost comparison of hospice care during the last few months of life to conventional care in the same time period. Medical expenses for patients in hospice care are substantially lower than patients receiving conventional care for similar illnesses. Therefore, this means the projected savings of patients choosing euthanasia would be much smaller for patients under hospice care. Not only will legalizing euthanasia not save as much money as many would have assumed, but the cost of legalizing its practice also must be considered. For example, in Oregon, as you brought up, the Deaths with Dignity Act contains requirements where we must consult physicians and get referrals for patients. This is more money we spend, and it increases the budget. Although euthanasia itself is cheap, you have to remember that there are steps there are steps that you take before that, such as visiting the doctor, getting a referral, getting a full checkup of what situation or what medical symptom you have before you can receive euthanasia. Continuing patients who are eligible to request euthanasia must have confirmed diagnosis from a prescribing physician and consulting physician, as such stated in the Oregon Health Authority's 2016 law. In the case that either physician believes the patient's judgment may be impaired by a psychiatric or psychological disorder, the patient must be referred for a psychological evaluation to confirm that the patient has sound judgment. Again, this is more money we waste on the patient itself, and in no way are we saving money at all. You're just creating a bigger amount of money that they spend. Continuing in general, you create a slippery slope of an increase in the price. And furthermore, there's also the aspect of when we look at it from a doctor's point of view. As such, many doctors might misdiagnose, or a family might not agree with the verdict of choosing euthanasia, and therefore we might have a creation of more lawsuits and more legal problems. As well as from a doctor's point of view, we have many doctors who are cost conscious, and therefore many are unfair and would violate the actual safeguards placed by euthanasia, and instead would choose euthanasia as a choice because it is cheaper and saves the hospital money, as well as it being an option to free up beds and just make the hospital have more room to adequate for new customers and new people in the hospital. And that is my argument against, for now, the argument against the economic issues of euthanasia.
And thank you so much. We are now moving on to social pro.
Hi, my name is Lorna. I'll be arguing the pro side of the social aspect. Well-developed nations such as Canada and the United States take pride in allowing their inhabitants to be free to make their own decisions and dictate their own lives. Such freedoms are so integral in modern society that they are written into the very legislation from which these great nations sprouted in the first place. The rights that citizens of these countries have are the rights to life, liberty, and security. So why is it that patients have this right taken away from them? Why are they not allowed to be autonomous, independent? In addition to providing patients with the freedom to dictate their own lives, legalizing euthanasia will also reduce potential lawsuits caused by its absence. A specific lawsuit filed by Jacqueline Alicia sued a hospital for saving her grandmother's life when she specifically stated she wanted to specifically stated she wished to not undergo any life-prolonging treatment. This lawsuit could have been completely avoided if euthanasia was simply legalized and Miss Alicia's grandmother had this option available to her. Furthermore, by forcing patients to live through intense pain, likely on some sort of life-prolonged treatment, valuable resources such as staff, hospital beds, and medication are being depleted and misused. Society's healthcare standards would be a lot higher if these resources were used by patients who can actually recover. 17% of all deaths in America occur in long-term healthcare facilities alone, and this isn't even including hospital deaths. Studies conducted also show that if healthcare is withdrawn, only a small fraction of terminally ill patients would actually die earlier than they would have with the treatment. This statistic, along with a high percentage of terminally ill patients exhausting medical resources, presents a clear conjecture. Giving patients the option to undergo euthanasia would reduce the number of patients depleting resources, and at the same time, it statistically won't reduce their potential lifespan by a significant margin. Thank you.
And now we would hear from the con side for social arguments.
Right. So you've already heard some of this speech, but I'll reiterate for more clarity. So again, beginning with a quote by American novelist Prellis Buck, with a tone on the con side of this debate, euthanasia is a long, smooth-sounding word, and it conceals its danger as long smooth words do. But the danger is there nevertheless. So again, the type of danger we see with euthanasia in this debate is of three parts today: economical, ethical, and social. The threat that euthanasia pits against the social and morale of society involves the value of life itself, where it essentially devalues the lives of the well-being new status of people that comes about from making this into a public policy. Now, from the three issues mentioned before, the first issue with this social construct is that euthanasia will not only be for people who are terminally ill. The second issue being that euthanasia threatens the social and moral attitude that is associated with the Hippocratic Oath. And finally, the third one, euthanasia will ultimately be an alternative to those who cannot afford the alternative treatments for their illnesses. Describing the issues in further detail, the first issue of how euthanasia will not only be for people who are terminally ill spans into the definition of the people who are eligible for this treatment in the first place. The problem with making this treatment legalized and public policy is that the nature of its use, meaning that there is bound to be a general set of people rather than a specific set of people to match its use in the first place. This already proposes an error in the application of logical use, because a specific type of treatment should only be limited to a specific type of people. Quoting, there are many definitions for the word terminal. For example, when he spoke to the National Press Club in 1992, Jack Kevorkian said that a terminal illness was any disease that curtails life even for a day. The co-founder of the Hemlock Society often refers to terminal old age, and some laws define terminal condition as one from which death will occur in a relatively short time, and others even state that terminal means that death is expected within 6 months or less. This brings up the secondary effect of euthanasia, where its use now implies the immediate ending of a patient's chance to overcome that illness, or merely they are assuming that they will only live due to the doctor's discretion on how long they will live. There are cases where people have lived far longer than they have from the doctor's discretion in the first place. Not only that, if you go into the second issue, the fact is the euthanasia threatens the moral attitude that is associated with Hippocratic Oath. A doctor's job in a social way is not supposed to end people's lives. They're supposed to improve it. They're supposed to take care of you. And not only that, but they are tasked with trying to help you out in this painful journey in the first place. If you legalize euthanasia, the job description for a doctor in the Hippocratic Oath is immediately broken merely because it's going against their very purpose of existing for the profession. And finally, on to the third issue, euthanasia will ultimately be an alternative way to those who cannot afford alternative treatments for their illnesses. This is the major crux of the social attitudes for euthanasia in the first place, merely because you are mentioning the value of life only being cheapened by the low cost of euthanasia in the first place. This presents the fact that our lives are going to be tasked with only this price tag, and it's going to be ended shortly simply because it's a cheap alternative. This creates that special group of people who can use euthanasia, however, the special group of people who can use alternative treatment. However, if those who cannot afford euthanasia, alternative treatments in the first place, they will only be defaulted to the euthanasia treatment, as you've stated before, because of its cheapness. That will be concluding on the con side of the social aspects of our debate.
Thank you. We will now be moving on to the ethical pro-argument and then the con.
So my name is Anisha, and this is Eamon, and we're going to be arguing the pro side of the ethical aspect. So, it is important to give patients the right to die, as it should be up to them to decide if they either want to live for however much longer while experiencing physical and mental suffering, or end their lives painlessly. They should have the right to die with dignity and avoid a lengthy road to death if they wish to do so. Our healthcare is set up to prolong a human's life for as long as possible, but this may just prolong unnecessary and pointless suffering. Not to mention that lots of pressure is placed upon both families and the healthcare system to spend time and resources on patients that have little or no chance of recovery and are inevitably going to die anyway. Euthanasia does not shorten one's life, but instead lets people have control on how they wish to end it. In 1991, a Dutch report into euthanasia found that in 86% of cases, euthanasia shortened life by a maximum of a week and usually only a few hours. In other words, it was a last resort used by patients in unbearable agony who would rather that agony ended now than in 2 days' time. Alternatively, even if euthanasia were to be illegal, it will likely still occur, so it's better to give people the ability to safely euthanize than to have them experience a painful death. Decriminalizing it doesn't mean it will encourage people to end their lives. It just provides the option open for those who wish to take it.
And euthanasia also should be illegal because there are people who have serious illnesses, diseases, and disabilities that cannot be treated. So according to Canadian law, the advanced state of irreversible decline in capability, meaning death must be reasonably foreseeable, to ensure that patients need to go through some safeguards to ensure that they're truly qualified for an assisted death. They first need to write a written request, which must be signed by 2 independent witnesses. There are, however, conditions placed on who the witnesses can be. So, for example, they cannot be providing medical or any personal care to the patient. They also cannot own or operate where the patient is being cared for, and they cannot be beneficiary to the patient's will. After the written request process, there are at least 2 doctors or nurse practitioners who must have to evaluate the request and decide if the patient qualifies for the assisted death. So what qualifies them? Well, as mentioned earlier, they must have a serious illness, disease, or disability, along with experiencing unbearable physical and mental suffering from that illness, disease, and or disability. They cannot be relieved. And finally, when the patient is at the point where natural death is reasonably foreseeable. And lastly, it is obvious not all doctors will be comfortable with assisted dying due to their personal beliefs and values. So federal law states that legislation cannot force doctors to provide or help patients with assisted death. Patients are also given the choice to withdraw from the request at any point, which is why we're on the pro side of euthanasia, as citizens may make choices in our lives to choose what to control and choose whether they want to continue their life or not, or whether they want to end the suffering or not.
We will now be moving on to the con side for ethical.
Hi, my name is Jada Price, and I will be addressing why euthanasia is not ethical. Accepting euthanasia means accepting that some lives, such as elderly and people with disabilities, are worthless than others. Legalizing euthanasia would send a clear message. It is better to be dead than sick or disabled with no hope. For a healthy person, it is easy to perceive life with disabilities or illness as a disaster, full of suffering and frustration. Euthanasia is not in the best interest of the person. It is easy to imagine cases where a patient could request euthanasia freely or under pressure, while it goes against their best interest. The diagnosis could be wrong, and the patient is not suffering from a terminal illness. The prognosis is wrong, and the patient might not die quickly. The patient doesn't receive good care enough and could be alterated, and that the doctor does not know that the other treatment options, and it could be offered to the patient. The request for euthanasia is often a cry for help. The patient does not really want to die. They want to see the symptoms and fears treated and revealed. Euthanasia encourages vulnerable people to end their lives. Directly or indirectly, euthanasia imposes many pressures on the elderly people and people with disabilities. These pressures stem from a family or a society. Patients who are ill or dependent often feel worthless and a burden to their families and their loved ones. The growing number of cases of abuse or neglect of elderly for those with disabilities illustrates that the major issues to consider. An overburdened health care system limits the quality of care and may create pressure on their patients, making them to choose death. Patients estranged from the family may think that the euthanasia is the only solution. Saving the pain of the patient is just ending their suffering, but think about their families. The families will still suffer, and it's possible, it may be worse. Then the grief is differently can shut themselves out and to when they aren't able to talk to anyone, which will eventually lead them to suicidal thoughts. So euthanasia is not ethical. It can lead to many of these situations to where it could affect their families, and it can just make the patient feel like that is the only option, is to die, and give them no hope and not think of anything that could possibly happen to help them. Miracles can happen, and giving the patient this option to be euthanized, well, that is just taking that chance away. That is why euthanasia is not ethical.
Okay, thank you so much, Texas. So now we'll be transitioning to our 35-minute rebuttaling period. It's going to end approximately at 4:25. And we'll start with rebuttals from this side, and then we'll give you a chance to respond.
Okay, so to start off, the opposition mentioned that euthanasia will end a person's life instead of giving them the chance to overcome an illness. It was actually referred to as a miracle by your side, and that's exactly what it is, a miracle. Statistically, miracles are not likely. They do not happen often. So by removing euthanasia as an option altogether, we're forcing people or forcing patients who are terminally ill, who statistically will not live much longer than is expected at all, to go through such pain and sorrow when they can choose to end it all right now. Who are we to take away that right and force them to go through their illness and live through it just because we deem that a miracle is possible, and that's exactly what they should be following? We should at least provide that right to them. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned earlier that instead of euthanasia, you could use euthanasia for patients who are only going to live a week more or possibly even less. Well, the issue with that and bringing that up in the first place is that why use euthanasia in the first place when they only have that amount of time? And this, transcribing with the whole miracle part, is you're also going to get rid of the notion that people who are going to live in this little amount of time should just die anyway and straight away. And people don't have a right. You are trying to insert that right into people's into people's choices. The matter of this perspective is that you're going to get people's minds riled up with that only euthanasia choice when they are tasked with this type of terminal illness. And the very real misdiagnosis and misprognosis also exists at the same time. If it isn't a miracle, then if it isn't a miracle in the first place, then there are a lot of other things wrong, and a lot of other things wrong that could go with euthanasia in the first place. If you want to bring something up.
Okay. So you mentioned that providing it as an option when they only have a week or so left to live is moot, is redundant. I disagree, because why should they have to live through a week of pain and a week of great duress and stress and discomfort when they have the right, or they should have the right and the freedom to make their own independent choices on their life? We can't, I know you said it's like feeding thoughts into their mind, but by taking it away, we're also controlling and restricting their freedom. So you have to look at it in that aspect as well, that we're actually giving them more freedom and more choice to dictate their own lives and their own decision by providing euthanasia as an option. Not forcing it upon them, but as an option.
If you want to mention something about that.
So as you were saying that that it's their right that we're taking away that right for them to not end their lives when they want to. The patient can end their lives when they want to at any sort of matter, but you're taking away other options that they might have, as in a hope, as I mentioned earlier, that you're just giving them that's their only option. And doctors are forced to do that when they might not believe that that is the right thing to do, that is the ethical thing to do. But since you're making it a law, you're making it a public law that they have to do that, the doctors might not, they don't have no option to say or like try to argue it, because it is a law if you make it legal.
And making euthanasia a right that people have and making it a choice is not something that people, people are readily available of. It's not their right. It's not their freedom. We aren't restricting anyone of their rights at all by not having euthanasia in the first place. They don't have that right. They don't have that right at all. You are again trying to put this notion that people should have this right, when that is only hypothetical if euthanasia were to pass. How it is now is completely different. People aren't being restricted. They merely want that experience all on their own. And making this into a public policy would make things much more different than such a specific use, because now it goes on to the general public, and it goes on to the duty of the doctors who have the Hippocratic Oath to enhance people's lives rather than just end it right there.
The question is whether this 2,400-year-old oath is an appropriate standard for evaluating policy today, and whether a doctor prescribing aid in dying medication to a terminally ill adult who requests this option to end unbearable suffering would violate the oath. If one were to ask most physicians, they would contend that their profession is based on improving the quality of life for many and to try to end an individual's suffering. Hippocrates himself, were he able to see the medical advancements that have been made in the world today, would say that this oath that he was the one that he created would not be in the same effect as it was 2,400 years ago. The difference in medicine back then and today is so different that this oath, while general and yes, do no harm, can be so easily changed and should evolve based on our standards of medicine today.
Continuing with that, again, with all the previous questions you've asked, again, in relation to killing someone in a week before they're about to die, again, it is a week, but it's a week in which a lot could have been done for the patient. And again, there are medicines that help alleviate pain. and help with the patient's suffering, and therefore may not feel as much pain as one makes it to be. Because again, we have strict medicine, we have other types of ways to really help a patient out. Continuing euthanasia would not be a right in any sense, given it is not given in the Constitution at all at any moment itself. Continuing, by saving a week in a person's life, it will not save a society, and if anything, it'll ruin it. We're saying that the best viable option is to kill someone off just because they're near death and they have no other hope left, and that should never be an option for someone. There should always be some other option given to the individual. And again, doctors at this point will begin to do things to sell scripts and to sell money, to earn money for themselves and not really worry about the patients. Where, again, you did state that in general, your whole argument states that we are doing this to alleviate the pain and the suffering of an individual. But if anything, there will always be underlying causes, such as saving money or an ethical or a moral issue. And there's always an underlying cause within each of these arguments.
So, you once again mentioned that there's some pain medications or treatment that can be done to alleviate pain and make that last week that they have more bearable, right? What else could they be possibly giving them that they've withheld before? If they've been getting treatment, then they're only going to get the same treatment for that last week that they've been getting, which is the utmost care that can be provided. If you think about it in terms of that, and from that standpoint, and the patient still wishes to end their life because they do not wish to deal with the pain, then why are we going to give them more medication and more treatment to make that last week more bearable when clearly it hasn't done that at all? You guys, like, the opposition is acting like we are forcing euthanasia upon the patient. We are simply giving them an option to do it if they want. If they wish to take the miracle route and hope for a miracle or go to further treatment to prolong their life as much as possible, they have that option. But for the patients who do not wish to go through another week of pain and stress, they should not have to.
In addition, when you need to also consider the cases of those that that there's absolutely no hope for recovery, such as those who are brain dead, who have gone into surgery to maybe have an operation where they could live, but it has not been successful and they are brain dead. So should not the family or the next of kin for those people have the option to say that this person will never recover, will never be awake again, or will ever be a person? They're already brain dead. It's in the word, it's dead. So they have no hope for recovery or anything. So should that person's family not have the right to say that, no, this person, were they alive, were they able to make a conscious choice? Right now, they would not want to be alive because they're technically not alive.
Also, adding on to that, you talked about how these medications, they can prevent their pain from elevating, but some patients, they aren't able to use things such as painkillers because, for example, they could be using anti-seizure medication, and that can interfere and that can also end their life. But the instructions were for them to not take things higher than such as a Tylenol.
So I'd like to address a few things that I've heard. You said you did believe in miracles. However, you said you didn't believe in miracles. However, aren't miracles a part of life as well? You're taking that liberty away from them by giving them this choice of immediate death. And this negative connotation that it adds to immediately ending a person's life simply because they are near to death is a negative impact on the moral fabric of society and on the social attitudes between that. And finally, and also, adding on, can you truly measure pain in a general way? The pain is individual and specific to the person, and it's unique. How a person feels is completely to them. It's not something to be measured by this type of public policy. This is why euthanasia shouldn't become a public policy, because there are many things that can go wrong, especially with the economic aspects, where doctors are going to be using this as an alternative if the patient cannot afford it. Meaning that will not disabled, old, and poor people suffer more simply because of euthanasia become a public policy? And can you measure the pain of the people left behind who made this decision in the first place? You may be alleviating some pain. However, that pain is completely uniquely to theirs, and you will never know how much they felt, and you will never know how much the family felt. And finally, volunteering is not a public policy at all. Suicide is voluntary, and euthanasia is murder. We are legalizing murder if we legalize euthanasia in this debate.
So of course we do believe in miracles and we do believe that they exist. Or what we were saying before is that we don't believe in the statistical probability of miracles. I don't want to make a generalization, obviously, but it is 1 in a million. It's 1 in a certain number. It's a very small number. That's what's classified as a miracle. So we're not saying that we don't believe in miracles. We're saying they're not statistically probable in today's day and age. And also, when you were talking about measuring a person's pain receptions, obviously it's different per individual, but obviously we're not forcing euthanasia upon them. It's their choice depending on their pain. Like your point said, it's individual pain. It's how much they're feeling in themselves that dictate if they want to end their life or not. Obviously, it'd be an extreme case where the person was saying, we feel pain to a scale that we cannot continue our life anymore. Or like like Roddy was saying before, there's also special cases where a person is brain dead, where they can no longer have receptors to actually be classified as alive. They are technically dead. And so why are we prolonging the economical strain upon the family? Why not just abide by euthanasia and kill off that person, because there's a lot of economical strain on that particular family.
I also wanted to mention what you said earlier in your social and ethical arguments. You talked about how these people, they're being put with the price tag because these are cheap alternatives, but it actually improves the quality of life. As many people fear death, they don't know how it's going to end, whether it's painful or painless. Giving people the option includes that people get to choose how they would like to pass. And perhaps the person is very fearful and they have the option of pushing a sense of calmness onto the person who wishes to die through euthanasia. And also you mentioned how it targets the vulnerable, and I just want to say that that is actually a myth. Legalizing assisted suicide, it's said that it would lead to pressure those who are old and want to infirm to end their lives, but in fact there's no absolute proof that proves that point. Sorry. It targets those in agony and lets one go as they wish.
Just to clarify on the last statement that a person made in regards to brain death, that is not one of the best examples to bring up, because of course if you are considering someone who is brain dead, then they are already dead. There is no need to imply euthanasia in a person who is brain dead. They are hooked up to a machine for however long a family wishes to keep him, and once the machine is turned off, they die. Therefore, why would you use euthanasia on someone who is dead? And again, there are many patients who have recovered from being brain dead, such as Taylor Hale, a 14-year-old who was considered brain dead, and then was awakened during her surgery before she was almost killed by a doctor, and not by being brain dead. And again, in relation to the last person's statement, what is the quality of life if you're trying to kill somebody immediately? And there is a certain underlying reason for euthanasia, and it also relates back to an economic aspect when we look at how hospitals need money for other treatments, other certain purposes. And if the pain is the choice, we could euthanize people for any pain. Then if you're saying the pain is the reason for why we must end their suffering, then just because someone is in pain, should we kill somebody? Of course not. And say, for example, a toothache or a ringing in the ears, these are examples that should not be cured with euthanasia in any way. And what happens to people in retirement homes, jobs, where when we have people in retirement homes, if we imply euthanasia to all these people who are suffering in those, because again, suffering does not just have to be pain, but it can be emotionally and in relation to stress or anxiety. and such as people in retirement homes who just don't want to be there anymore. If we start to euthanize all of them and kill them off, we lose employment for many people. We lose a sector of an economy, and again, there's lost medical research that could be very important for curing long-term diseases and stuff.
Just to bring up your point about brain death, brain death is irreversibly and legally and medically recognized as death. And I do understand what you were saying, that then it's not a case of euthanasia. But if you still think about it, that person, that could still be considered a form of euthanasia, as that person is on life support, and their family has to be the ones that decide whether they should be taken off of life support or not. So it is a question of ethicality as well as our societal morals and what we can, and this pertains to the argument of euthanasia.
Okay, now I would also like to look at the economical side of all of this. So if we consider a system of legalizing euthanasia, it transfers medical resources from those who want to die to those who want to live. Therefore, making euthanasia legal is a great cost control measure for the healthcare industry as well as for families to not fall into debt. Now, I'd also like to comment on the point made earlier from the con side of euthanasia, of making euthanasia legal. In the point brought up by the con side about how the savings are only $990 million, which represents only a fraction of the healthcare costs, making it negligible, it is vital to understand that the healthcare costs are a total and include the money that is spent from patients' families. Thus, the population as a whole is benefited greatly by euthanasia being legal, as a lot of money is saved by families, and these families do not go into debt. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to start this by saying that death is death, but is life really life? Not with euthanasia. You cannot bring this upon the people with the choice of euthanasia, because the economic aspects of this, essentially the whole thing takes out itself, because long-term medical research is jarred, and this medical research is the medical research in jobs and also helping old and disabled people, along with researching these types of diseases, is also gotten rid of if we just introduce euthanasia as a public policy. The logic with this is that instead of trying to keep people living and instead of trying to research these illnesses further, we are merely going with that euthanasia choice. And even if you say that it is merely the person's choice, obviously, as you stated before, if they are under that intense amount of pain, then they can choose euthanasia instead of living it out. And not only that, as I've stated before, this will become the alternative treatment for people who can't afford that type of healthcare anymore. Since euthanasia is the only cheap option left, and as you stated, will save this amount of money simply because of how much people are taking it, then why insist on why insist on making it a choice if it's that much of an economical aspect? If it's truly upon the choice of the people, then you shouldn't be bringing up this type of economical aspect to it, because not only does it take out your own argument, but it also, again, devalues the life of the people.
Okay.
He's trying to go.
I am. Okay, so you said that euthanasia. I'm blinking.
What? Sorry about that. So you were talking about how euthanasia, in terms of the economical side, in terms of economics, how each person's, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but each person's life can't be valued by a number, correct? Yes? Okay. obviously that's true. We don't want to value someone's life in terms of a number. But what we're saying is we're looking at in terms of the family cost as well. Obviously, we don't want to put a price on a number because that's a human being. There's obviously a more issue with that. But you have to look at it in terms of also just the family side. We're not looking up the number, but a family, especially in America, not to call you guys out, but it obviously is more expensive in terms of healthcare in America because it's not as paid for by the government. So the economical burden on those families is obviously so intense by someone who may be suffering from extreme illness such as cancer. The chemotherapy costs a lot of money to have those kinds of illnesses treated. So it has a lot of economical burden on the family. There's been many cases where the family has to sell their home, their car. People have to work overtime just to support this one person's life. And obviously that is something that is such an economical burden on the family's life. And we have to take that into account as well when we're looking at the economics, not just the whole, not the macroeconomics, the microeconomics. The one single person, we have to look at that family and take their issues into account.
And to touch on the point you had earlier about how we are using euthanasia instead of looking for treatments to certain conditions and doing more research on them. Conditions such as being brain dead, there are no medical strives to try to, well, not as many medical strives to try to cure brain death. In fact, I believe a couple have been tried but are unsuccessful. So to devote resources and time to researching brain death and keeping those patients alive is actually a misuse of resources when those resources could be turned towards finding cures to cancer or other more immediate causes of death. Thank you.
And sorry, do we just want to bring, we don't want to get information wrong. You guys said something about a person's disabilities affecting euthanasia. Can you just briefly speak on that point again, just so we don't want to make sure our information's wrong that we had here? You talked about a person's chances of undergoing euthanasia if they have a disability. Sorry, can you just repeat that point just so we know we have our information factually correct over here?
But so what I meant at the time was you're associating euthanasia and the use of it with someone's intense pain. And under this, it not only will this intense pain be available for those who are terminally ill, but also those who are intensely disabled due to this illness. This disabledness is, again, under this type of terminal illness. Not only that, if you are going onto the general definition of simply being intensely in pain, then someone who is recently disabled could be under that same type of intensive pain as someone under terminal illness.
Continuing with the medical aspect, in a study by the Pacific Research Institute in Canada, in Vancouver, they noticed that the Canadian healthcare system, in the way that they noticed that euthanasia should not be the reason to cure people from suffering, because we do notice that these families do tend to waste large, tremendous amounts of money on their individuals to help them and provide medical and stuff. But what we don't notice in the underlying cause of this is because the Canadian healthcare system has a horrible problem of waiting more than months to give their patients the necessary treatment for terminally ill patients, and therefore the Canadian government tends to spend $1.9 billion every year from making them wait. So therefore, if anything, if we should be fixing something, if we should be implementing something, it's not adding euthanasia, but instead of finding a cure for the healthcare system in Canada.
Okay, so I just want to go back to the point about disability. So you mentioned that those with disabilities are simply eligible for euthanasia. However, those with disabilities don't have an automatic right to it. In fact, the bill states a disability does not make them eligible for euthanasia, but rather due to the untreatable pain that is felt by the disabled. So right now, the preventative healthcare systems that we do have does not treat for this untreatable pain for the disabled. So let's take the Netherlands, for example, who legalized euthanasia for not just the terminally ill, but also people who are disabled, and they are suffering unbearable pain. As a result of this, they should be provided the right to have the assisted suicide. So Canada, the most recent nation to legalize euthanasia, allows it also for the disabled alongside the incurable disease illnesses, and they go hand. Overall, there is a diagnosis for the disabled prior to this allowing them to choose the suicide.
So, sorry about that. So you mentioned, sorry about that. Okay, hold on, let me bring this up. So you mentioned earlier about disabled people not being automatically granted the right to euthanasia. Well, the way I used it was in context of intense pain. As I said before, you are going to be using this as a general definition for people who are going to be allowed to be under euthanasia in the first place. And doing it this way means that you are getting rid of the specificity of each person rather than just having it case by case. You're having it in a general sense in this decision. You can't be both alive and dead at the same time. The government is of the people, and it's the people, what's it called? Sorry. And the government is of the people. Again, as I've stated before, euthanasia is not going to be an economical treat for if it's legalized, but the cost and underlying issue of that is you're going to be getting rid of much of the economical aspects that make up the medical field today.
You talked about how there's going to be a lot of medical disadvantages to euthanasia. Can you just provide a list of examples, possibly, of the potential negatives of using this in terms of the medical field, please?
Right, sorry, could you repeat that last statement? That was me.
So we were just asking, you talked about a lot of potential negatives to the medical field in terms of euthanasia. Would you provide examples of these types of negatives in more specific sense?
So, by what I meant from the medical fields in the first place is you are getting rid of researching. That is an important aspect of the medical field. You're getting rid of the funding of these types of illnesses. And as you stated very specifically, you can't research brain dead. That's not what I intended. We are researching the illnesses that lead to brain death in the first place. If you are getting rid of the funds for that in the first place via euthanasia, then you are getting rid of much of the aspects of the medical field. Since this research is going to be much less prosperous if you do end up using euthanasia as a type of economic aspect.
So, of course, we want to increase our medical research. There's been a lot of medical developments in terms of special patient care and prolong that life. But you also take into account that, yes, that benefits the medical field, but that does not benefit the person always. Because I think you brought up a point when you're talking about the amount of government spending that goes into this, how they keep these people around in Vancouver for a month at a time, but you have to take into account the ethicality of that. This person's in pain, and you're prolonging their pain because you want to do medical research for them, or maybe cure them. That's obviously not always the case. Maybe they want to ensure that they cure this disease, or whatever the case was in Vancouver. Maybe they want to cure this person's illness. But there's also the ethicality of that. Should we be able to dictate when we should medically research into a person's life, even if they want to die and they want to kill themselves in a legal way? Should we be able to dictate that and control that aspect of them, or should we give them the freedom of the choice to actually make the choice to want to end their life because of the prolonged suffering? Or should we want to improve our medical care because we're researching into this? There's the ethicality aspect. Sorry. Sorry. So yeah, there's the ethicality of that point. I just want to also bring up we have about a 5-minute warning, so each side is probably going to get around 1 or 2 more points in.
I just want to add, you also have to look at how many of these patients that are brain dead or suffering from a really dangerous illness or condition are going to actually choose euthanasia as an option, right? There are going to be some patients who choose not to undergo euthanasia who can be further studied, or some patients' families who do allow their loved ones to be donated almost to science to conduct more research. Like some patients will choose euthanasia as an option, and yes, while you're right, it does take away from the potential research. It, however, does not remove the research as an entirety.
Our point, of course, the patients are suffering, but that is not because there isn't sufficient medical care and there isn't sufficient research. The problem with that is that we have lengthy treatment delays that are a normal attribute of the Canadian single-payer healthcare system, and this is causing the patients to reach a point of terminal illness to where we can't fix it or we can't cure it. And so, if anything, it's not about implementing euthanasia as a viable means of fixing it, but it's making sure we fix everything that underlies and leads to the point of needing to use euthanasia. Having to wait months for a treatment or any type of medicine is not okay and is wrong. And we need to make sure that it's fixed so these patients can receive the medicine as soon as possible and make sure that their suffering goes away, and as well as making sure that we do not reach a point where euthanasia needs to be used.
Referring back to an earlier statement made, if we do choose to not provide this option, if we choose to keep these people alive in medical facilities, we're seeing a significant impact on the amount of financial dependency that these patients have in these facilities. In fact, it is within that last year of life that about 25% of these medical expenses are spent. It is the most demanding financially part of that patient's life in that term where that money is spent. So if we do choose to not give this option, and again, might I reference back to the fact that a doctor will only provide this option if the doctor in their medical and professional judgment deems that there is no course of action that will result in a favorable outcome for this patient, and this is the only option left aside from letting the disease take its course. That is what is going to be the product of what's going to happen. So that is the only reason in which this would even be presented in the first place. And then moving back to the point, if that instance were to occur, then the doctor would again use their medical judgment. And that option provided to patients allows for that financial funding to be used in the research that could prevent these cases in the future. So what we're saying in essence is with the introduction of euthanasia, we can hopefully move towards getting rid of euthanasia, which seems maybe a little backwards on paper, but is the ultimate outcome of letting euthanasia be an option for patients, to use that money and better direct it towards research and better direct it towards ways that we won't have to resort to euthanasia. Thank
you. But again, you state a point, as you stated at the beginning of your argument, of course, maybe the few last months or the last years might spend a lot of money, but this is money they could have had and money they could have used for that time if we had not been making them wait long times in the hospital, charging them all this extra money, the $1.9 billion to be exact, that they could have used to pay these treatments that they needed at the other stages. And as well, as you stated, why should we implement euthanasia and then take it away? That makes no sense. If you're going to apply euthanasia, then euthanasia must stay and must be used. If you're not going to apply it, then let's not apply it. Please be clear on the side.
Just to clarify on the point that I had stated earlier, it was more of an ironic outcome of allowing euthanasia to occur. Euthanasia would be something that we'd introduce, and it would allow medical industries as well as the families of these patients to save that money, which in turn would forward a lot more research, encourage people to conduct this research and fund that research, which in the end would result in fewer cases of euthanasia.
But again,
Sorry, I just want to say we are at the end of the time. We will allow you to get one more point in. That's okay. I know you guys probably want to rebuttal something. We will allow you to get one more point in, then we move on to conclusion statement.
Well, no, actually, one more point in. Right? Yeah. Go ahead and say your point.
But again, with the cost you said, is these drug industries do need the money, and of course, where will they get the money from? The patients who need to buy the money. If no patients are using the medicine, then we cannot keep providing medicine or even update it and provide research for it. Again, this all goes back to how the money is being wastefully spent because we are not giving the proper treatment quickly enough for them to be cured, and instead we're waiting long times for them until they reach the point of no cure, and then that's when we need to apply euthanasia, and that's being caused on purpose. Then, if that's what we're doing, not by accident. We need to make sure we target it beforehand, before we ever reach a point of euthanasia in this case. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll be moving on to our concluding statements. We will begin with ours. So the implementation of euthanasia has many potential benefits for society as a whole. Looking at the economical impact, the benefits of legalizing euthanasia in countries vastly outweighs the pros, or vastly outweighs the cons for illegalizing it. Looking at the cost of life per person, it heavily outweighs the amount of money spent on killing someone. Also, socially, not providing euthanasia as an option for patients contests the very freedoms that our nations take great pride in providing its citizens in the first place. And lastly, looking at the ethicality of euthanasia, is it not better for a person to have the freedom of choice? Whether they should live or not should be their choice alone. It allows people to have the freedom of choice, truly what a democracy is about, having the freedom to choose their own path. Therefore, euthanasia has great potential for positive change in society in terms of economical, social, and ethical standards. So it should be legalized. Thank you, and you may present your concluding statement.
So, in conclusion, euthanasia today has been established that, on our side, that there are much more cons than there are pros. Specifically, there are only a limited short-term amounts of pros versus the much more long-term sides of cons. Looking at it specifically for each issue, economically, you will only be saving a little bit on that short term once euthanasia is introduced. However, long term, you're getting rid of much of the medical field and also much of the economical aspects that are surrounding the drug companies. And also in a moral aspect, in a social aspect of people's rights, you have to realize that people can't have rights if they are dead. People have rights because they are living in the first place. Euthanasia isn't a right, it's simply contradicting the law of not murdering people in the first place, because you are legalizing murder if you legalize euthanasia. And finally, on the ethical aspects of this situation, you're adding a negative connotation to people's lives if you do enable euthanasia in the first place, simply to the matter of the Hippocratic Oath and simply to the matter of the doctor's jobs of keeping patients alive. Thank you.
Okay, I'd just like to thank both our team here and you guys over in Texas for an amazing debate. It's always a pleasure to get new perspectives on different topics and to debate with you guys as well. We kept it really civil, which I enjoyed, and the points on both sides that were made very clearly and respectively. We look forward to connecting with you guys again.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.